Welcome to Politically Basic. I'm your host, Kyle Campbell. On today's show, I am so glad to welcome Pete Peterson. He is the Dean of Pepperdine School of Public Policy. Dean Peterson is a leading national speaker and writer on issues related to civic participation and the use of technology to make government more responsive and transparent. We love that. He was the first executive director of the bipartisan organization Common Sense California. You've probably heard of that, which in 2010 joined with the Davenport Institute at the School of Public Policy to become the Davenport Institute for Public Engagement and Civic Leadership. Dean Peterson has a long and extremely impressive professional history, including co-creating the training seminar Public Engagement, the Vital Leadership Skill in Difficult Times, the Leading Smart Communities program, which explores the ways in which technology is changing local government processes, and co-directs the American Project on the Future of Conservatism, which I'd love to hear more about. He serves as a fellow on so many prestigious councils. I think we'd use up all of our time listing all of them. So I'm going to keep bragging on him on our website, politicallybasic.com, where you, our listeners, can enjoy reading all about the work that he's done to accomplish incredible things in the world of policy and politics, including the very fun fact that you were a candidate for California Secretary of State in 2014. So welcome, Dean Peterson. Thank you so much for being on the show with me today.
So great to be with you.
Thank you. Well, I would like to just jump right in and tell our listeners that today we are obviously talking about public policy. And you are the expert here. You are brilliant. And I mean it when I say that your resume is so long that it would take too long to go through everything. But the reason you're here today is because you know public policy inside and out. You're our expert. And I'm so glad that you're here to talk about it. So I'm going to jump right in with you and ask you, Dean Peterson, what in the world is public policy?
Well, it's a great question. I think it's important in defining public policy that we pull apart the two words that define it, right? Because everybody is familiar with policy, right? We have policy, if we were to compare public policy to private policy, policy at the private level is something that we have in our families, right? If we want to talk about family policies around when our kids go to bed or budgets, how we set our budgets, where we spend money on. As we grow out from that and think about private policy and businesses, for those of us who work in corporations or small businesses, all of these businesses have different policies, whether it's how we hire people or different aspects of how we promote products. All of these are governed by particular policies. The important difference between private policy that we're all very familiar with, even if we don't call it policy, right? We don't call when we set our bedtime for our kids policy, but that's
rules.
That's right. That's right. But when it comes to public policy, that is the entire domain of the question, how should we govern ourselves? And in that, the big difference between private policy that we set at either, the business level or in our families becomes much more about how policy is determined about how we live together. And in that, it is essentially refracted through the democratic institutions that we have, especially here in the United States, whether it's our local government, we think about how state governments operate. We obviously think about the federal government as well, and how we deal globally. And we'll get to that in a little bit. But there are often comparisons made between public policy and law. And law, obviously, is a field of rulemaking, if you will, or a part of public policy in which if laws are broken, there are repercussions for that, right? And those can range anywhere from fines to prison time to obviously even the death penalty can be part of that. Some say that law and public policy are two different things, but I actually see that law is a part of public policy.
Sure.
So to be very specific in defining it, public policy is at once how we govern ourselves, how we live together in community, whether that's at the local level, the state level, the national level, the global level. But it includes law as part of that. It also includes those rules and regulations that aren't necessarily legal. In this sense, they could come out of a variety of what you might call administrative institutions.
Okay.
And we can get into some specifics as well in that. But they are essentially shaped by the public at their best.
Right.
And we can also talk about some ways in which public policy is not really that public.
Sure.
But they are shaped by our democratic institutions.
Okay, interesting. So if I'm boiling this way down, the people influence how our rules are set, what those look like, and the law enforces that.
Right.
Is that right? Is
That's
that like the most simplistic way I could talk about that?
Abraham Lincoln said it better than anyone in his Gettysburg Address, that government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Well, what is government? Yeah. Government is essentially outlined and defined by public policy. Laws are a part of that, but that really kind of essence of public policy in the United States is that it is how we govern ourselves of the people, by the people, and for the people.
So I love that, right?
Yeah.
That in our nation, which makes America, again, set apart and so special, is that the people really do have the power to influence, and our representatives do just that, represent the wishes and the desires of the people to create these rules.
That's right.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's fantastic. Well, maybe you can explain for our listeners, now that we kind of have a better sense of what public policy is, because I think sometimes we hear those words and it's hard for us to make the connection of how public policy affects our lives on a day-to-day basis, but it is threaded through everything.
It is.
We can't take a step out of our front door, well, even inside our front door, without public policy making some kind of determination about how we live, or the choices that we make, or the rules within how we're operating on a day-to-day basis.
That's right.
So there at Pepperdine, you guys have the School of Public Policy. And let me just pause for 1 second and just say that Pepperdine University does not suck. It's in Malibu. It is the most gorgeous college campus, I think, maybe anywhere. I might venture and just go ahead and say, like, it's probably the most beautiful college campus in America.
Yes.
Maybe somebody wants to debate me on that. I'm happy to.
I am too, by
I'm
the
a
way.
fan.
I am too. Yep.
It's wonderful. There's so many fabulous schools on that campus, but the School of Public Policy just focuses purely on this.
That's right.
And let's take a step back and just, how did you come to Pepperdine, and how did your educational experience in your life kind of bring you lucky son of a gun, to beautiful Malibu, California, and to lead the School of Public Policy there?
Well, it's a circuitous route, and in one that I think in many ways involves public policy. So I grew up in the Northeast, was born in New York, grew up in New Jersey, went to George Washington University in DC undergrad. That's kind of where I caught the political bug.
Absolutely.
Had a number of friends that went on to work on Capitol Hill, work in think tanks, and I obviously got to know a lot about politics, at least at the federal level, through that experience. But while politics was always kind of a hobby of mine coming out of GW, my day-to-day was really in the private sector. I worked in marketing and advertising for the better part of a dozen years, and experienced in my mid-30s what I describe as an early onset midlife crisis.
Okay, you got it done early. I like it.
I hope I've gotten it out of the way, which was being in New York on 9/11.
Oh, wow.
And that day for me was as it was for a lot of people in my generation, was a watershed moment where people really thought about what they were doing with their lives.
Right.
Right. I mean, I know I had friends that.
I was at Pepperdine. On 9/11.
Yeah.
When you were in New York, and everyone remembers exactly where they were.
That's right.
What they were doing. It was the most profound event, kind of global event, I would say, of millennials generation. Yeah.
So I had friends that because of 9/11, they went into the military. Others went into public service in different ways. For me, standing in the middle of Central Park on that day and looking downtown at what used to be the World Trade Center, I just had this overwhelming feeling that I couldn't keep doing what I was doing. I didn't know exactly what that meant, but I knew the world, as metropolitan as New York is, when 9/11 happened, it almost felt like the world just completely opened up. And the only way that I can define it is that I felt like the work I had been doing was not what I was called to do.
Sure.
And that day essentially propelled a quest, if you will, over the course of the next 1.5 to 2 years, in which I did a lot of reading, exploring, being in community with others to think about what was I doing with my career. I mean, I enjoyed what I was doing. I really loved the work that I had a chance to do. I loved being in New York, but it just felt like I was being called, and in my view, called by God to do something else.
Wow.
And for me, what that meant was taking what had always been this passion and hobby in politics and putting that more at the center of what I was thinking about from a career. And that prompted me to think about going back to graduate school in my mid-30s. Initially, I was very kind of focused on the graduate policy schools in what you could call the DC to Boston corridor. Obviously, I knew about GW. There's Georgetown, NYU. Wagner has a policy school. Harvard Kennedy is probably one of the better known of these policy schools. But through some family connections, through my wife, who's from Southern California, they have friends of theirs who are alumni of Pepperdine and knew that I was doing this searching about going back to school. And we came out here for a visit, and it was almost as if I knew what I was going to experience at the policy schools at GW and these other schools. But when you come to Pepperdine, there is a different approach in two really, I think, profound ways. One is it's one of the very few policy schools at a Christian university. So the role of faith in shaping moral leaders and public policy was something that wasn't available in these other programs. That just wasn't a part of their worldview. But the other was that Pepperdine and the policy school takes that great DNA that Pepperdine has as a great liberal arts, great books program, and incorporates that into the policy degree in ways that these other programs
that's so
do.
interesting.
So you study the quantitative aspects of policy, which are important, as well as the historical and philosophical aspects as well. And I just,
that was the fit for you.
That was it.
Well, I love what you're saying because, twofold. One, you were having this very powerful moment, as many of us did on 9/11, and kind of you talk about things opening up for you. And I actually think Pepperdine is that university that does come at these issue areas and arenas with a very open perspective. And also that, we live in a nation in which our founding was very influenced by the Bible, by faith. I just had Tim Barton from Wall Builders on, and he talked about the detailed and intricate research that has gone into our founders' influences. And so, of course, studying public policy from that perspective makes great sense. So I love that. And I love that, that you felt that connection and that was that fit for you.
And I think it's also important too, and we can talk about, again, back to the question of what is public policy and who shapes it. It's been the American experience, unlike many countries around the world, that public policy isn't only formed by government. It is also formed and shaped by we as individual citizens, but also working in conjunction and collaboration through civil society. And that faith-based segment of civil society through Christian nonprofits, faith-based nonprofits of different faiths, certainly through churches, synagogues themselves, has always been a part of the American experience, and uniquely so. And so a number of our students will go on to work at faith-based nonprofits. You think about groups like Prison Fellowship and Samaritan's Purse and others who were doing such great work in the policy space, but through faith-based institutions. It really is an important part of what we do at the policy school.
Amazing. So you went to school there.
That's right.
And now you're dean.
Right.
The end.
No, that's it.
How did
Great
that
show.
happen?
It's been fun.
They're like, we sure like you a whole lot. And your name is Pete Peterson, and it's public policy at Pepperdine. For those of us, including myself, and we just love alliteration.
That's it.
What a great fit all the way around. So how did you end up here in this position of leading?
I think it's
school?
fair to say that if you had asked me at graduation of the program, would I be sitting here with you talking about the work I do as dean? Just never would enter my mind.
Oh, that's amazing.
What happened was in my second year, it's a 2-year master's in public policy program, also acronym is an MPP. I had a professor, former president of Pepperdine, a gentleman by the name of David Davenport, who was teaching a class on civic engagement. What are the ways in which citizens can influence public policy outside of government?
Yes.
So that was
we like that topic.
Yeah. So that was my thesis paper that I was writing with David as my professor. He was also on the board, the co-chair of this bipartisan nonprofit you mentioned before called Common Sense California. So David sees that I'm writing my thesis paper on this. They had just gotten a grant to hire their first executive director of this Common Sense California. The mission of that nonprofit was to promote civic participation in California.
Brilliant.
And he says, Pete, we just got this grant. You're doing this work. Would you like to sign on to be our first executive director?
Wow.
And we did it.
What an opportunity.
And so after commencement, after graduation, this was back in 2007, I signed on to be the first executive director of Common Sense California. And so the work that I started doing around the state of California was essentially promoting citizen participation, right? What can we as citizens do to affect and shape public policy from outside of government? It may be in collaboration with governing institutions, but at the same time, not directly from government. So
that's great.
That work at the nonprofit, I did for the better part of the next 5-6 years. We looked at a way, we started doing training of local government officials in how to promote greater civic participation at the local level. That led to some work we were doing in certificates that we were offering. And then we began to look at a partnership with an educational institution. And that led back to a relationship with Pepperdine to create this Davenport Institute. So I headed that up for the better part of 6 years. Ended up running for office because the work I was doing at the Davenport Institute was actually around civic participation. The chief elections officer is the Secretary of State in California. I got to know the then Secretary of State, knew how, frankly, screwed up the office was, and decided, really without a lot of political connections, but really having a passion for these issues, that I would throw my hat in the ring. And so did that in 2014, came back off of that, was asked by President Benton to serve as interim dean. And then in 2016, I was named, after they did their search, the dean of the policy school.
This is so great, Pete, that you're talking about this run for office and the connections that it has with your educational experience and the work that you're doing now, because you're living it, right? You are living your mission there by having that experience. And now that you can speak into encouraging others to do the same. I mean, that's the whole point, is how do we get involved and, outside of government, or actively participating by running for office. So I think that's really, it speaks volumes about who you are as a person too, and that you would take on that challenge and gain that experience for yourself too, so that you can go on and influence students coming through your program and beyond.
That's the great thing about an educational institution, right? Which is, it's a force multiplier.
Right.
It's one thing to run for your office yourself, and I had a great experience doing that. But I often describe myself as the most grateful dean in America because I get to work with kids that I know are going to be shaping their communities and states and nation and world. And I do think we're in a moment where that essential definition of public policy, which again goes back to that Lincoln government of the people, by the people, for the people, that people are really wondering whether that is still the case.
I would agree with you there.
Right. And if we're not doing what we
yes.
can to return public policy, what Lincoln called government, that's just, to me, another word for public policy. If we're not returning it to of the people, by the people, for the people, we are going to see some of the distrust and problems and polarization that we see today.
Right. So it might be happening now. We'll leave that to our listeners to make the determination for themselves if we're feeling a little disconnected from some of the decisions that are being made at higher levels. And we don't feel that we as everyday average American citizens are a part of this process. So let's talk about the process. And maybe you can break down for our listeners too, what does that look like? How are public policies determined? How are they created? How are they affected? How does it work?
Well, I think one of the things that's maybe a way into answering that question is to provide an example that everybody knows about, but they may not think about it in the public policy context, and that is the response to COVID. Now, I would have guessed that could be a sensitive subject.
That's okay, because what we're doing here on Politically Basic is making it okay to talk about these things again. So,
very good.
Folks, we're going to get into it. Okay. It's going to be okay. We're here for you.
Yes.
And here we go, because this is the best example of understanding how public policy, number one, can go very well and affect our lives for the better.
Right.
How it can go very wrong and ruin lives, literally.
Yes.
I mean, I don't think that I'm exaggerating too much when I say that some COVID policy ruined people's lives.
Right.
And also, I'd love to hear your perspective on public policy in theory versus in practice, because I think it's important to understand, and that's kind of a separate conversation, but understand how some policies make their way through the process and they sound really good. And then when they're put into practice, maybe it doesn't go the way that we think it's going to go.
So I think if we're thinking about, well, what is the goal of public policy? In the American context, we have no better phrasing than the Declaration of Independence when the founders and Jefferson used that phrase, the pursuit of happiness.
Yeah.
The pursuit of happiness really should be taken as the end goal of any public policy.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to understand that happiness in the context that Jefferson used it was not happy, shiny, smiley people. Happiness was a classical ancient term that meant an understanding of who we were made for as individuals.
Wow.
What were we made for?
Say more about that.
Yeah, so
I haven't heard anyone break down that terminology. Here in my mind, I'm thinking like, oh, America's so fire that we have that in our declaration that we want to seek out being happy.
Yeah.
But that's not exactly what the intention in our current understanding of being happy is.
The classical understanding, and the ones that our founders were drawing from when they were using that phrase, was an awareness, I think, best understood in the Christian context, which was that we were created by God for something.
Yeah.
And another way of describing that would be calling, right? That
living our purpose.
That's right.
Our God-given purpose.
Right, exactly. And that can range completely and utterly, right? But how government is instituted and how we understand the importance of public policy is that it needs to allow for that space, for that freedom and liberty, for people to pursue that happiness, right? And again, let's look at that whole phrase. It's the pursuit of happiness. It's not the guarantee of happiness.
Yes.
It is the pursuit. But it's also not the blocking of happiness either, right? So if we are to understand that the goal of all public policy, classically understood by our founders in America, is the pursuit of happiness, then how do we go about creating those policies that provide that opportunity for the pursuit? So we look at COVID.
Yeah.
Two important things that help define how public policy is made from the COVID experience. Number one, in the American context, public policy in government is created at different levels. We obviously have the federal government, and in most cases, when we think about politics and policy, we really look to Washington, D.C., but it's been the American experience, and I think a lot of people learned in some new ways from COVID that actually policy is also determined by states.
Yes.
We are indeed the United States of America.
Right.
So you had states determining very different policy approaches to COVID. You had the Florida example and the California example, right? This wasn't the federal government. They may have set some bracketed, policies on the outside, but there really was, in our constitutional system of federalism, states really had that freedom to respond in different ways. And I think we've seen that certain states succeeded in their policy responses.
Right.
I would argue the states like Florida and Texas did, while other states, I think, really had some problematic responses like California. The next level, though, I think is also important, is that states weren't the only policy generating organizations or institutions or agencies. You had counties. And here in California, you could go from one county to the next county, and even within the state of California, have very different experiences.
It would be different. Absolutely.
Parks were open in one place.
Right.
They were closed in another. Businesses were open in one county.
Yes.
They were closed in another.
And I would say that Orange County was actually a very good example of this.
That's right.
Being most set apart from the rest of the state in how they set forth their regulations and how they were sort of policing those regulations.
Absolutely right.
So interesting how it sort of trickles down the sort of political leadership ladder, so to speak, and how complex and complicated for those of us trying to just live lives, or anyone who operates outside of your own small space, right? If you own a business or you travel, or it just affected us.
If you have kids in school.
Absolutely.
Right.
And
so that brings up the last part of the levels of public policy, which is local government. And I think some people learned in some new ways that, wow, living in one city can be different than living in another.
Right.
Being in one school district can be different than living in another.
Absolutely.
And so this awareness that public policy, especially in the COVID example, is still determined at the very local level. You saw this real uprising, and I think in ways that are actually encouraging, when people actually started showing up for their school board meetings.
Yes.
When they started actually running for school board, when they started showing up for city council meetings and county administrative meetings, that they had this new kind of a civics education.
Yes.
That you can actually be engaged in shaping policy because the COVID experience taught us the people not far from us were determining whether our businesses were open, whether our schools were open, where we could go to church, whether our churches were open. Just incredible.
Yeah.
But the response, I think, has been encouraging. So the tiers of public policy is one thing. The other part is the difference between the public policy decisions that were made by elected officials and those that were made by administrative officials.
Oh, that's an interesting distinction. Maybe you can explain what that means.
I think in new ways, Americans understood that there are people who are not elected that are nonetheless setting public policy decisions that affect our everyday lives.
Wow.
Perfect case in point. Los Angeles County. We have a county health officer. That person is not elected and is frankly in the county charter, and this would be true of counties across the country, is unaccountable to the elected county supervisors in the decisions that person makes. And so it actually wasn't the county supervisors who were making decisions about whether businesses were open or closed, whether schools were open or closed. It was an unelected health official.
Now, okay, for those of you just listening to audio and not watching on video, I'm making the face again. I'm making that this doesn't make logical sense face.
Right.
So we know how that played out. It was frustrating.
Right.
It was infuriating for some people. There were lawsuits that came out of this. County employees sued. I want to say maybe, was it the firefighters? I don't know. There was a lot of sort of like people seeming to work at cross purposes in trying to figure out, and I'm mostly talking about the vaccine mandates, I would say,
That's
was
right.
sort of the biggest issue that came out of that and
Yep.
how we were touring, because it affected us. It affected our physical bodies,
Yes, it
right?
did.
And so
Right.
it was sort of the most egregious way that people felt that someone was trying to force them to do something that they maybe wanted to do or maybe were okay with. And a lot really just said, you know what, I don't know enough about this, or I don't agree with it, or it goes against my beliefs. And what recourse did they have? And it was very confusing.
Or they may agree upon it for their parents or grandparents,
Sure.
but didn't want to give it to their kids.
Right.
Right?
Yes.
So many of these decisions were made by unelected administrators. These are public policy decisions, just to be very clear about what public policy is and what it looks like.
Yeah.
But it didn't really involve the public.
It didn't seem to.
It didn't.
It involved the public in that the public had to comply.
That's right. They
It
were on
didn't
the
involve
receiving
it
end of
the
it.
other way
That's right.
when they didn't want to do that.
That's right. That's
and then
right.
what do you do? I think this is a good example for and time for me to ask you, you know, again, as just a regular citizen, what do you do in that scenario? What is your ability to ask questions, to push back, to challenge the system, or
Yeah.
is compliance the only option?
No, I think what we're seeing, there are historical moments, and we hope, God willing, that COVID was a once a century thing. We had the smallpox pandemic back in the early 1900s. Here we are a century later, may it be at least another century
Right.
before we have to deal with this. But the public is still engaging on this issue.
Yes,
They're doing
very
it
much
through
so.
the courts. They're doing it, I mentioned before, people running for school boards.
Yes.
People getting much more engaged in local government, understanding in new ways that policy is being set and determined by people that they didn't even know existed. I think that's actually an encouraging thing.
Yes.
Right? And so to say how people can be engaged, I think that we're still seeing the ramifications of COVID,
Right.
and we may continue to see that for decades to come. COVID was as much a cataclysm of public policy as it was of anything else.
Wow.
And so we're still seeing the ramifications in elections. You know, we had that recall attempt here in
Yes.
California.
There's another one afoot.
There's another one afoot.
And
And in many ways, we remember that our governor here in California was seen at a very high-end
Yes.
restaurant as public policy was telling
Sure.
the rest of Californians that they shouldn't go to the restaurant. He was there.
Yes.
So there were ramifications where the public was being engaged in that political process because of COVID public policy. I think that we're going to continue to see that for years to come. This story is still being written about how Americans can and should engage in policymaking.
And that's a good thing. That's what we want.
Yes.
We want people, you know, awake to what is happening, the decisions that are being made, the influences that craft those decisions. I want to venture an opinion, and I'd love your take on this, that we were just really kind of lazy before all of this exploded on the scene, and we kind of just we're busy with our day-to-day lives.
Yeah.
Everyone has so much on their plate.
Yeah.
Who has time to go chasing down someone and dig through sometimes very worded in very complicated ways, policies and legislation, and then make a determination on whether or not we think that that's good or should be changed or should be challenged. This is what someone who is maybe attending the Pepperdine School of Public Policy would dig into. But in our everyday lives, who has the time and ability? And I love that COVID, so much good did come out of COVID.
Yeah,
I'm going to take
ton
my
of silver
Pollyanna
linings.
moment, and I'm just going to
I'm with
say
you.
silver linings.
Yep.
You know, it did open up these opportunities, open our eyes to opportunities to become more invested and more aware about what's going on and ways that we can serve. So I love that you're highlighting that. And I do hope that that trend continues and that we feel that we know how to become more civically engaged in this process. Because at times, too, it does kind of seem like there is this barrier to entry between how do we operate as citizens or residents and just everyday average people and have an effect on politics, policy, the law,
Yeah.
when we're not in those positions.
Yeah.
And so I love this conversation because I really want our listeners to know at the end of this conversation, okay, I need to be more aware. I want to be more involved, and how they can do that.
Yeah. Well, I think it's important to note, one of the very important books that's part of the core curriculum at the policy school is a book written by the Frenchman Alexis de Tocqueville. He wrote a book called Democracy in America in 1833, in which he was one of hundreds of Europeans who came to the United States in that early 50 to 100 years of American history. And one of the things that comes out in that very important book, Democracy in America, but also a lot of these other travelogues, was Europeans could not believe how much civic responsibility was placed on American citizens.
Right.
They were so used to having kings do this and government officials take care of everything, and said they were just kind of, I mean, there's a reason why the people of England are called subjects and we are called citizens.
Wow,
and
that's profound.
And so it's worth noting, it's not easy to be an American.
That's true.
We require a lot of our citizens to be engaged, involved, and informed. And so it's okay that we went through that period, as I think you rightly explained, that you rightly say, it was part lazy, it was part trusting. We just trusted people were going to do right by our kids.
I don't mean lazy in a negative sense. I just think we did not feel that we had to be spurred into action to step in there.
That's right.
We were trusting. That's the right way to say it. Absolutely.
And so with that, I think that the different levels, what COVID did, I think, and I totally agree with you, it's a real silver lining. It was once a civics lesson, teaching people that different levels of government exist. And even if you don't know who your school board is, they can really make determinations that affect your everyday life.
Yeah.
But also it's an invitation. And I think we have to take it as an invitation that whether we're looking at issues at the local level, the state level, or the federal level, that we're either involved in public policy decisions or we're involved at our best in determining who's going to make those decisions.
Yeah.
And that's obviously when we're talking about voting.
Yes.
The importance of voting in local elections, even if you're not going to run yourself.
Right.
The low turnouts that we see for local elections, whether it's for school board or city council, these are opportunities that we as concerned citizens really need to be involved in.
I want to talk about this because every now and again, you'll hear this wild story about somebody running in some low population area, like unopposed, or they win by one vote.
Yeah.
I mean, this happens.
Oh, yeah.
It's not out of the ordinary, really. I mean, it's out of the ordinary, but it's not impossible that this happens. Every vote matters. And two, again, talking about that barrier to entry, I think that sometimes we have this notion that it's very difficult to run for office at the local level, or it's scary, or someone doesn't have the proper education or degree or experience. And I don't really think that's always the case. You've got to start somewhere, and you've got to cut your teeth and get that experience somewhere. And so the local level is a wonderful place to start. And we have backup, right?
Yeah.
We have organizations who are available to help if you are wanting to run for office. We have
Let me give an example.
Okay, great. I would love an example.
Totally nonpartisan website, but friends of mine created a website called runforoffice.org.
I love that so much, and we can remember that easily. Runforoffice.org, of course.
And it's a very simple website. You actually just put in your zip code once you get to the homepage, and it will show what are the open seats. Now, again, these can be like the Parks Commission in your town. They could be for school board, could be for city council. But you can see what the available offices are wherever you live in the United States that you can run for.
Brilliant.
And again, it can, just like you were saying, it can start very kind of modest with running for a local commission to learn a little bit how the local government works and who the players are and all that kind of stuff. But it would surprise most of your viewers and listeners to know how many open seats go unfilled in elected offices at the local level.
That's incredible.
I mean, tens of thousands.
What?
Yeah. I mean, if we're looking nationwide.
Wow.
And so understanding where that point of entry can be, and the fact that, as you say, that barrier to entry may not be as high as you think it is.
Yeah.
I really can't encourage your viewers and listeners enough to at least investigate.
Okay, do it. Go right now, runforoffice.org and find out what's open in your zip code.
Yeah.
I think that is so brilliant. I love that resource exists, and what a great way to serve your community, which I know so many people are looking to do and have a heart to do, but also on a path to really, influential civic service in our nation. I mean, we have had a president who started off as a community organizer.
Yeah.
I mean, people come from more humble beginnings in this space and really are able to accomplish some remarkable things. So
that's right.
I love that. Talking about this part of public policy, and sort of grassroots, starting small at the local level. Let's talk about the importance of elections, voting, and down ballot voting.
Yeah, so good.
Because again, I think this is sort of a concept that gets lost a little bit in the mix. We're so focused on a presidential election and the weight and magnitude and ripple effect, multiplier effect that electing a president or electing a governor or a senator will have. But really, it is so powerfully important that we are having good people running for office at the local level, and that we know who we are electing, because you talk about public policy creation, regulation, oversight.
Right.
It's all happening at those levels. So I would love to hear your take on the importance of that and what's happening right now in our country with regard to what the ballot's looking like.
Yeah. So let me just pick up something you mentioned before, just to further emphasize a very good point you made. The more local the election, the fewer votes that are going to determine who wins. And you're right. There's a phrase in political science called rational ignorance. And it's a term that's used to describe why people don't vote. And rational ignorance is essentially the concept that says it's very rational to be ignorant of politics if you construe that you're just one of 100 million votes.
Right.
Okay? That's a rational response. You start getting down to some of these local races, you're not one of a couple 100 million anymore. You may be one of hundreds, maybe one of dozens. We have, even at the state level in the state of California, I'm sure you know that we have one of the governor's great priorities, which is this a ballot measure number 1 on homelessness, a $6 to $7 billion fund. That election was weeks ago. It's so close, we still don't know who has won. Wow. Whether that's going to be an approved or disapproved measure. Right. So even on...
Incredible. It's such a huge issue that affects... It affects everyone in the state, but also, from an economic perspective. And we're talking about, obviously taxpayer dollars are funding these massive, very expensive initiatives. So it has tremendous impact on our day-to-day lives.
And when you get into some of these other races for school board, when you get into city council races, certainly when you think about these county supervisors, obviously names can change. I know where I grew up, we called them freeholders. Were the title of the people that ran the counties. But COVID taught us in some new ways that these more localized office holders really can have a greater impact on our lives than even the President of the United States does.
Yes.
And so, as you say, these down ballot races are important to learn about because your one vote actually will have an outsized impact on these localized races. Now, here's the thing that I think I have to say, unfortunately, is intentional. In many of these local races, they are not usually held in what we would call the typical election cycle, which would be November.
Yes.
I'm sure some of your listeners and viewers know that some of these local races are held in March and April and June. Like, why are we...
Yeah.
I think it's unfortunate there are people that have set these election dates in such a way that they are counting on low turnout.
That is really unfortunate because it can be difficult to get out on the regular election
Yeah.
day. Let's be honest. And there have been a lot of conversations recently about that,
Yep.
about potentially making it a national holiday
Yep.
and everyone having the opportunity to have a free and set apart separate day to go vote. But you're absolutely right. When it's on a random day, so far away from the first Tuesday in November, sometimes it just passes us by. And how do we combat that? What would you say is the best resource for people to just be able to kind of keep up on when those races might be happening? I mean, if you're registered to vote, you should be receiving some materials in your area about that.
Yeah, you should be getting that. Most of the county election officials are sending that information out ahead of time. I do think, though, and we're starting to see more of these policy decisions around the country where councils and city councils and county supervisors are actually trying to calibrate election dates for local races to move them all to November.
Right.
I think there's growing awareness that, frankly, it's in some people's best interest that not a lot of people turn out to vote, right? It becomes easier to control the outcomes of those elections if you know that only, LA, this recent election, I think we had 25% turnout for the mayor's race. I mean, that's like incredible.
Yeah.
So, again, it just puts more responsibility on us, but we have to take it on knowing that our votes in those kinds of races are really going to have an outsized impact.
That's the point, is that those matter tremendously. We can't just let them pass us by. It just has too much of an effect on us. So as we're approaching a really critical presidential election. I think sometimes we like to say every presidential election is the most important of our lifetime. I kind of feel like the host of The Bachelor, where it's like the most dramatic rose ceremony ever. This is the most important presidential election of our time. But I mean, okay, it is. Let's be honest. It really is. As we, as political parties, sort of continue to kind of drift farther apart, I happen to think that people are desiring to come back toward each other more. But, we still are kind of far apart on a lot of issues. We hear sometimes this saying that we should be selecting a president not based on personality, but based on policy.
Yeah. Yeah.
What say you on that theory?
Well, I think it's worth saying that the American president is a distinct position in that they are not simply a policymaker, but they are a representative. When people think of different countries, and certainly when they think of America, they think of who the president is.
Right.
I have family that live in Australia, and it has become very clear to me that the steps and decisions made by our president are a way that they understand America writ large.
Right.
Right. So to say that there's one or the other, I think that's very difficult. I think certainly policy is part of it, but there is also that quality of leadership, how they understand the identity of the country in ways that other elected officials, senators, congressmen and women, mayors, so forth, they just don't have that same role. One thing I would, though, want your listeners and viewers to understand, especially as it regards to this election that I think sometimes goes unnoticed, is that when a presidential transition happens, it's not just one president, one person coming into the White House. There are thousands of presidential appointments that are happening across the different federal agencies. So we talked before about how do we understand how public policy is formed? First, it's on a tiered basis because of our federalist system. Second, it happens not only with elected officials, but also with administrative officials. A presidential transition is a time of massive public policy change that is happening across the different federal agencies as a presidential administration makes thousands of selections of who's going to be in everything from the Department of Homeland Security, the State Department, Department of Education, the FBI, the Department of Justice. Obviously, we think about who may be selecting future Supreme Court justices.
Absolutely.
But I don't think we take, we consider deeply enough that it's not just the person in the White House. It is the thousands of public policy making officials that come along with every presidential administration. So it's important to make a decision based on policy and to understand that, you know, we have decisions to make based on the president. But that's frankly only a small part of the overall policy making apparatus that will be impacted by your vote.
Wow. You've said a lot of profound things here in our short time together, but I think that is probably the most important. And I really want everyone to hear and understand this point that we've talked about the ripple effect. This is the really important, really key ripple effect that installing a president has nationwide. It's not just who's sitting in the Oval Office. No. It is nationwide leadership and public policy creation. Wow.
Let's just take one example, quick example. A lot of people are focused internationally and on America's role in the world as it relates to what's going on in Israel and Gaza.
Yes.
A lot of people are seeing Secretary Blinken, the Secretary of State. And what somebody thinks of that person's role, I frankly have deep issues with the current administration and their position on that conflict. That was a decision that was directly tied to who was elected president.
Yes.
And you can extrapolate that again to all these other large federal departments, that whether we're talking about environmental policy or commerce and trade, or whether we're talking about the justice system, all of these decisions are tied directly to that presidential vote.
100%. And the border is another good example. Because and we're talking a lot about it, and it has a lot of impact right now for every American citizen and those who are not citizens as well. But on almost day one of the Biden administration, we heard that he sat down at that desk and unwound a lot of policies that had been put in place by the Trump administration.
That's right.
Particularly having to do with border security.
Yes.
And so isn't that also incredible and should be weighted in our decision-making process as voters, that those policies that one administration sets in place can seemingly pretty simply be unwound with a signature.
That's right.
And that's sort of mind-blowing in its own, the power that an administration has to affect us all on a national and international basis. And
again, quickly. Those decisions made on those unwinding of the executive orders, which are public policy decisions, right, are also being led and executed by presidential appointees in those different agencies, right? Wow. So if we think about Secretary Mayorkas and the Department of Homeland Security, you know, those are presidential appointees, and not just at the top levels, not just at the secretary level. There are undersecretaries, deputy secretaries, thousands of people who are determined by the presidential administration.
As voters, our voice really matters. It has power, and we need to be using it with confidence.
And please don't hear me say that we should only care about the local and not care about the national. We obviously, as we've just discussed, there are issues that are only determined at the federal level that we should be deeply concerned about. And those are decisions that we really need to be engaged on as we enter this election season.
Most definitely. I want to bring it back to Pepperdine as we're kind of getting to the end of our conversation, but wrapping it up in terms of if someone listening wants to consider this route and how they can serve their nation, how they can serve their local communities, how they can really fulfill that civic duty in a powerful and influential way. obviously we all want to go to Malibu. So let's be real about it. Okay, come on. I know I keep coming back, but it's just so, it's so beautiful. And Pepperdine's such an excellent university. What are some of the ways that a degree or master's or a PhD in public policy, what are some of the pathways that people can pursue once they've gone through a program like the ones offered at Pepperdine School of Public Policy?
Well, let me just say one thing. I'm so glad that you have the audience that you have, because these are people that are engaged and some are making decisions about career paths for themselves.
Yes.
I obviously made a significant career change decision in my mid-30s.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And we're seeing more of that now. I mean, it's not always the traditional high school to college to graduate degree process. And it's totally flexible now.
Right. And so we see a number of students that come to get their graduate degree because they want to facilitate that career change. Right. So our students are going off into what I would call the three main sectors. They're going off into the public sector. So that can be government from the local level to Capitol Hill. There's the nonprofit sector. Those can be think tanks in Washington, D.C. They can also be faith-based nonprofits working on homeless policy at the local level. And then the final sector is the private sector, because we have alumni that are working in the media. We have alumni that are working in corporate communications. They're working in government relations. There are a number of private sector policy related careers out there as well. But I have to be selfish to take this time with you just to try to encourage those out there to at least give thought to working for the government at some point in your life.
Yeah, it's not terrible.
I mean,
right? Can we speak openly about this stigma that is surrounding government employees and government work? I mean, it's not terrible.
Well, and again, I just think that it's part of the American experience. As we said before, the founders always knew that we were going to place more responsibility on our citizens than any other country on the planet. Yeah. And part of that responsibility is being informed and being engaged and listening to shows like this and voting and doing volunteering and doing those things. But for some, it actually may mean thinking about a career change or thinking about a path that maybe they didn't think about before. Maybe it does mean going to work in the State Department. Maybe it does mean going to work, dare I say, for the FBI. Or working.
Well, that just sounds cool as all get. I'm sorry, that sounds rad.
I mean, these are pathways, right? Much less working in local government.
Absolutely.
Because these are, again, just such vitally important positions that we either have the right people in those positions or we don't.
Yeah. Thanks for saying that, because I do think there's a misconception about government work. But this is a way to channel your desire to affect change, your desire to be an activist, into positions of real power and influence. Yes. And I love that. I love that we can sort of point them in this direction, because that's where it's at, and we don't always think that way. Yeah. I love that. Well, as we wrap here, our show is politically basic, so we're talking about the basics. But I love to have a politically extra moment of every show, because let's face it, a lot of times people in politics are extra. So, right? They get a little nuts. Yes. But my politically extra moment of this show is actually going to be a question for you. Okay. And my question is, what's the most outrageous, ridiculous piece of policy you have ever seen or experienced in your career? Okay. Because sometimes people really push the envelope, so to speak, and try to push something through that is just wildly insane or maybe not so driven by what the American public wants or is needing. Or sometimes we just have really archaic public policy that people don't realize is like still on the books, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like there's some county in Georgia where it's illegal to eat dinner with a fork.
Yes.
Something anyway.
Yes.
Yeah. I've heard of that.
Well,
not necessarily public policy, but you catch the drift here.
Well, I'll try to tell the story quickly. It was one of the weirdest experiences I've ever had in public policy, and one that connects directly to the importance of citizenship. This was 2010. I get a call from somebody. I mentioned this Davenport Institute. It's kind of our local government institute at Pepperdine. And a person was a former city manager advisor on our board, great guy named Ken. Ken calls up and says, Pete, I've got good news and bad news. I said, well, what's the good news? He goes, I'm coming out of retirement. He had been city manager for a Central Coast city. I said, great, where are you going? He goes, I'm going to do an interim city manager gig in Bell. Now, people should look up the city of Bell, because in 2010, the front page of the LA Times had a headline that said, is a city manager worth $850,000 a year?
Stop it.
And in what became a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative series of stories, the LA Times found that this city of Bell, California, maybe 30 miles from downtown Los Angeles, was the most corrupt city in America.
Oh, I remember this. It's ringing a bell. It's ringing the bell.
Yeah, very good.
Thank you.
So the
Crush
city,
that one. Wow, I do remember. The city
manager was making almost $1 million a year. It's a city of 30,000 people.
And everyone's like, doo-doo-doo. Yeah. Going on about who was not noticing this, by the way?
Well, this was it. So my friend Ken, the city manager, got perp walked into jail.
Fun.
My friend Ken was the first interim city manager to follow this utterly corrupt person who was leading the city.
That's shockingly
And
bad.
there were a number of other people who were making way more money than they should have been. Again, it was a systemic corruption in this very tiny city.
Wow.
So Ken brings me in to be part of the advisory group that's going to try to rebuild, because the corruption was so bad, the city was on the edge of declaring bankruptcy. That's how much money had just gone out to these. Right.
Maybe crack the books.
Yes.
Anyone else?
It took an LA Times reporter to request the budget, right?
It's so bad.
So the election that created this system of governance, that created this level of corruption in a city of 30,000 people, had a turnout of 212 people.
Wow.
That was the election that put Robert Rizzo, the then city manager, into that position, that essentially created this environment where he could essentially, and several other people, including the city council, which was entirely recalled. All the city council members were recalled. But it was that awakening to the people of Bell that they said, I guess things are kind of okay. You know, kind of weird seeing the city manager driving a car that he's driving, and boy,
city manager's got a new orange Lambo. No big deal. You know.
I mean, there were these kinds
School
of stories,
spirit.
right? The people were kind of wondering, something doesn't seem right until that story broke.
But again, there's this sort of implied trust that we have, and
that's exactly right.
Who's going to take the time, and also these are the people who have influence over probably local law enforcement, and who wants to be brave enough to try to get in there and crack it wide open.
And it took
interesting
that happening to make people aware, oh my goodness, I have kind of let this happen. It's still a democratic system, right? There were still elections for people to turn out to and to learn what was going on, and maybe show up to council meetings during this. I mean, this was like a 5-year process that was finally resulting in all this corruption that we saw. Yeah. But it taught me, just in some very profound ways, the importance of this local engagement and the power of just a few individuals to either create a place where there can be the pursuit of happiness or the place where there's just utter corruption. And the fact that it could happen an hour and a half from where we're sitting right now,
Yeah.
here in America,
Right.
just was really that amazing example, that profound example to me that engaged citizenship is really our only hope.
Absolutely. Wow. What an excellent politically extra example. I had forgotten about that.
Yeah.
Don't be Bell.
Don't do
is
it.
the moral of that story.
That's right.
Don't be Bell. But it is a great example. And I think
Yeah.
such a perfect place to conclude in what you're saying. And I loved everything that you shared today. I just think it was so meaningful what you're saying and gives us a much better understanding of public policy and how it has so much power to influence our everyday lives. And I hope that you all have taken a lot away from this conversation. I know that I have. And I just want to thank Dean Peterson one more time for being here with us on Politically Basic. Your vote, your voice has so much power. Don't forget it. And today's conversation really elicited a lot of ways that we can put that power into action. Take a look at what open seats are in your area. Take a look at Pepperdine School of Public Policy. Be engaged in what's going on at the local level, civically and beyond. I just really encourage everyone. And as Dean Peterson just explained in this brilliant example of a local government gone rogue, we've got to participate and pay attention to what's going on. It is our civic duty, and we are lucky to have it in this country. So thank you again to Dean Peterson. And for more information about him, about the School of Public Policy at Pepperdine, and about ways that you can be engaged locally and beyond, please check out our website, politicallybasic.com. Thanks so much for joining us. Please continue to follow us on socials at Politically Basic and anywhere podcasts are found for new episodes as they drop. This has been Politically Basic with Kyle Campbell, where we break down the basics of every political issue so that you get to decide.